Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham, and today I'm going to be talking to Bentley Allan, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and a transition pathway principal with Calgary-based Transition Accelerator. Bentley is also an expert on industrial strategy and policy, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. Should it be a key component in Canada's response to Donald Trump's tariffs and the pressure he's putting on our country? So welcome to the interview, Bentley.
Thank you, Markham. It's really great to be back on the show.
Yeah, I've had you on a number of times on my podcast, and I'm a big convert to industrial policy. And one of the reasons why is because of watching China and looking at China's battery and electric vehicle industrial policies. And you dealt with some of those. I've been reading over a paper that you co-wrote with another fellow, Strategies of Green Industrial Policy, How States Position Firms in Global Supply Chains. And you talked about China, and maybe you could summarize the argument for that case study.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought you were going to say that you were convinced about the importance of industrial strategy, due to the personal arguments and charm that I have brought. But I'm just as glad to hear that it's from learning about the real world cases and learning about what actually works in the real world.
Oh no,
Um,
Bentley, I want to point out here, it really was your charm that convinced me.
just one person at a time. That's all I can do.
There you go.
Um, so that paper is really meant to break down the preconceptions that we have about industrial strategy. And those preconceptions are that there's only one way to do industrial strategy, first of all, which is this highly centralized East Asian development model. And that secondly, that countries play to type within the overall universe of potential industrial strategies. And what we did with the case of China specifically was show that they're actually moving away from the East Asian development model, the classical Korean and Japanese style of doing industrial strategy. And they're actually, in some cases, using market-based mechanisms as the tools by which they conduct their industrial strategy. So that's one thing we're trying to break apart, is say, well, actually, the tools are not all centralized top-down tools. In many cases, countries can use a market-based tool in order to achieve a strategic end, which is also industrial strategy, right? Tariffs are now often equated with industrial strategy. Well, you don't even need tariffs to have an industrial strategy if you do it with innovation policy or strategic investment on the supply side, for example, right? I think of tariffs as being one of many demand side tools that you would use in a broader industrial strategy. So what we were trying to show with the case of China is that China does a lot of things really well in its industrial strategies, but one of the things it does is use market-based mechanisms in order to induce competition between the firms. And that's what they did with their vehicle credit policy. And in fact, this was how Tesla made a lot of their money, actually, was getting receipts from this government industrial strategy, where there were transfers from internal combustion engine manufacturers in China to electric vehicle manufacturers, which were mostly Chinese firms, except for Tesla, who was there to teach the domestic electric vehicle firms how to do a good job of their industrial strategy. So that's just to say that there's a big, broad universe of industrial strategies. You have to be smart about what kind of strategy you're applying, and the conditions that determine which is the best strategy are highly sectorally specific. They're not national, they're not historical, they're highly sectorally specific.
That is a great segue into my next question because most viewers will know that a couple of weeks ago, Energy Media launched the Canada 2050 campaign, and it's got three components to it. And so, one, add value to natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, grains, whatever it is, electrify, and so we need there's already been a lot of discussion about, kind of a national power grid and lots more east-west trade in electricity. And number three, build all the infrastructure that you need to support that particular strategy. But the specifics of adding, how do you go about growing these industries that add value to natural resources? Well, the answer for Bentley and myself is industrial strategy and policy. And that gets to your point, Bentley, about them being highly sectoral specific. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, what we see in real world cases. And remember, at this point in the paper, we're not really trying to provide advice. We're just trying to show what states tend to do, right? And what we're doing there is trying to identify in the sectors, can states really figure out what's going on and what their strategy should be or what the supply chain should look like, right? So is there high uncertainty or low uncertainty for the state in terms of creating the thing that it's trying to do? In the case of Japan and Korea, they were benchmarking themselves to the United States. So there was relatively low uncertainty. They knew what the car industry needed to look like. They knew what the electronics industry needed to look like. There wasn't an open technological frontier that they needed to explore in this more decentralized fashion. You could use a highly centralized industrial strategy in order to achieve it. But in most of the cases of the energy transition, we have higher uncertainty. We don't exactly know what the role of hydrogen is going to be. We don't exactly know what the role of various other resource plays in Canada might be. And in those cases, maybe we need a more bottom-up, less severely targeted, less centralized strategy in order to be successful. At least that's what we have found, is that has tended to be the way that states carve up that space. But I do think we're getting more and more information all the time. We have a really good idea of what the battery electric vehicle supply chain is going to look like. And there, people are always constantly saying, oh, there's so much uncertainty. We have to do sodium ion, or maybe it's zinc air, or whatever. But the fact is that the lion's share of the decarbonization in the transport sector currently and over the next 2 decades are going to be done by the basket of technologies that are already commercial right now. Lithium ion batteries, either nickel rich or lithium iron phosphate. And we just need to scale those and build the supply chains for those. So we have strong certainty. Now, the question is, do we need to break into a global supply chain or not? Do we have strong competition globally or not? And that determines how involved the government needs to be.
Okay, and then I've got a little bit of a case study here, or an example maybe that you can address.
Sure.
One of the Bloomberg last year came out and said that Canada was the number one country with the most potential
Yep.
for critical minerals, and critical minerals go into batteries. So we know that China controls like 70 to 90% of the refining and smelting of turning minerals into battery metals. And so if you were in North America and you had some lithium that needed to be processed, you'd have to send it to China and then bring it back, which makes no sense at all. So North America is trying to build a battery industry. We know what a supply chain looks like because we have the example of China and also Korea to some extent.
Yes.
So we know what it looks like. We can benchmark against another industry. We have the minerals. So is this an ideal case for an industrial strategy in which government at both levels, or all three levels, play a coordinating role with the private sector, with labor, with other stakeholders?
Yeah, I do think that this is one where we have low uncertainty and where it's going to be difficult to break into those global supply chains, and therefore there needs to be a strong government role. But in the middle space, between a firm-driven or a decentralized or a bottom-up strategy that's very exploratory and a more centralized strategy are these collaborative strategies that we highlight in the paper. And that's what Europe did in its battery alliance. And I think that that was a good model for the Canadian battery alliance, if it ever came into being, where really you need to have the government and industry working very closely together, but there's definitely going to need to be a strong role for the government in such an alliance.
Sure, because there needs to be a policy and regulatory framework. There might be the need for de-risking, it's called. So technologies are not quite ready to commercialize and scale up, and there needs to be some subsidy or other tax credit support in order to fund that, get them over the valley of death so they're ready to scale up, those
Yep.
sorts of things. And governments have been doing this for a long time. Maybe just not as part of an industrial strategy or a very strategic approach, but a lot of this stuff it's not like it's rocket science. It's not like we haven't done it before.
Absolutely. And in the case of the battery supply chain, I think the midstream is exactly what you're talking about. So the processing step in the battery supply chain between the mines and the batteries themselves, that is where de-risking and active government support for the firms is going to be necessary because we just do not know how to do this very well in North America. We've got great firms. We have good experts, firms like Nano One that are potentially world leading. But what we need to do is make sure that they have strong support to get through this long demonstration and development period that world-leading firms need to go through in order to scale and become true players in the midstream. But then in other clean energy supply chains, so you mentioned Prime Minister Carney, who has talked about backwards and forwards linkages in the auto sector, and I think that that's a smart idea. There's also the mass timber supply chain that he has talked about
Right.
getting high quality advanced wood products, which reduce the amount of carbon in buildings and also are easier to put into prefabricated and modular elements. You think about the whole supply chain there, but there the problem is not the midstream. We know how to do the midstream quite well. In fact, we have potentially world-leading firms in the midstream of our mass timber production supply chain right now. The problems there more are actually on the supply side. Where are they going to get wood from in an industry that is focused on creating raw lumber and sawn wood and getting it out to export markets before they add value? And then further downstream on the demand side, ensuring that there are incentives to make sure that mass timber is actually used in buildings. So in each supply chain, in each sector, you need to think differently about exactly what the problem is, and therefore what the right policy mix is, and therefore what the role and the strategic orientation of government is in that. And that's what we're really trying to drive home.
And so the approach that Canada could take here is the federal government in cooperation with the provincial governments, because that's just the way Canada works. If you don't have collaboration and cooperation, nothing goes anywhere. But
That's
so
right.
let's say that we get that kind of cooperation, and I've listed off five or six sectors: oil, gas, timber, minerals, grains. There are others. Uh, so we have a strategy of getting what would you call them, hubs, collaboration going along those lines. You identify where the supply chains are, how much of that we have in Canada, what potential we have in Canada, who's going to do what are the resources required, on and on and on. I mean, there's a process here that is not unknown. Folks like you have documented this in
Yeah.
your academic research, and then we systematically go and pick off those opportunities in the supply chain that fit our circumstances. Correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Right. So
It-
the impression I want to leave, the conclusion I want to leave with my audience today, Bentley, is that this is not some kind of black box. Economic development strategy is not unknown. We know how to go about doing this. What we need, once we get the political will and everybody agreeing we're heading in the same direction, which Trump's threat to Canada is maybe a once in a lifetime opportunity to do
That's
this,
right.
then we put in place the tools that folks like you are familiar with.
Yeah, I would go one step further, and I would say
Right?
that I get pushed back a lot when I'm trying to convince folks that a collaborative, active government role in industrial strategy is necessary, because people say that, well, we can't pick winners. We couldn't possibly put our thumb on the scale. Um, and two, they're just unsure about industrial strategy. And what I would say is we 100% have an industrial strategy right now. We just do not have one that is public. We are 100% picking winners. We are just not having a democratic conversation about which winners are being picked and exactly how much public resources are being allocated to that. And we are not injecting independent expertise and critical attention into the industrial strategy decisions that are being made. And the form of the industrial strategy that we currently have is predominantly passive. The government hands out a lot of subsidies, but does so in these programs that are completely open for applications from any firm that would like to apply. And what that means is we spread the resources across every possible opportunity area. Therefore, we don't focus, we don't achieve scale, we don't have any global competitiveness that we could possibly achieve from these one-off investments. And we've gotten along okay on that. We've done okay as a country. But in a time in which we have a national crisis, we need to get focused and we need to get more active in the way that we're determining these investments. And in a world where democracy is at threat, we need to take these processes, which are happening below the veil of democratic attention, and bring them up onto the table where we can have a robust debate about them, right? And if we can do that, then we can improve our industrial strategy. As you said, there are many, many proposals about how we create processes and strategies and policies that can pull this off. That's not the problem. The problem is admitting that we're doing it and really deciding that we as a nation are going to come together to work together.
So let me give you an example, a real world example that we've worked on for years and years, probably since about 2017, 2018. So Bitumen Beyond Combustion is a program of Alberta Innovates, provincial innovation agency in Alberta. And they have developed, they're very, very close, maybe a year away from having a commercially ready, scalable process to turn bitumen into the precursor that makes carbon fiber. So you'd make the first of all, you take the bitumen, you have the raw material we currently send to American refineries. You turn it into, you have a plant that turns it into precursor. Then the precursor goes into the manufacturing plant to make carbon fiber for cars or planes or whatever it is. And the Alberta government owns the intellectual property. So I don't think you could come up with a better way to add value to a hydrocarbon resource than turning it into a material. Now you're not burning it. Now you're adding four times the value because Alberta Innovates has done the modeling, and you get $50 for a barrel of bitumen into a refinery. You get $200 if you turn it into carbon fiber. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of reasons to do this. The missing ingredient here is the players to come together and say, this is the opportunity we want to exploit to add value to this particular resource. Let's be strategic and let's get moving on it.
Yeah, somebody has to make that decision and that call. And I do think that in a decentralized democratic society, it has to be the government that ultimately makes that decision. But it needs to do so in collaboration with, as you laid out very clearly in that example, a wide range of experts and stakeholders that are providing good inputs that the government can use to make good decisions.
Yeah, I would agree. And I totally agree with you about the fact that we have been passive. So you remember a couple of years ago when the government came out with the Clean Growth Fund and they were like, I don't forget, 15, $20 billion of money. And what the government did is it said, okay, we're going to have this fund and then we're going to open it up and you come and put in an application. And then we'll consider that application and we'll make you run through a bunch of hoops, because we have to do due diligence and so on. And there was no greater strategy with an active approach. It was like, we'll just open the doors and the customers will come and firms will come and put in applications. That's the way we always do it. And as you say, it's inadequate at a time of crisis when you have to move quickly and strategically.
Yes, I agree that that's the weakness of the Clean Growth Fund, but I would say that it's a major improvement upon its predecessors, especially the Strategic Innovation Fund.
Sure.
And it's an improvement for two significant reasons. First of all, the Clean Growth Fund has a wider toolkit than the SIF did. The SIF could just basically make grants. The growth fund can do a loan guarantee, an equity stake. It can write a contract for difference, or it can provide a grant. So it has a much broader ability to be catalytic in the way that it
Okay, fair enough.
is unlocking opportunities. And I would say that the staff at the Canada Growth Fund have really done an excellent job in stretching that toolkit. And if you look at the first projects that they have done, I'm as impressed with the way that they have calibrated the tools and used a whole range of tools as anything else that they have done. I also think they've made relatively good investments. I agree that they aren't focused in specific priority areas. And maybe the growth fund could continue as being, one pot where we do have a rigorous external assessment that has this wide variety of toolkits, but that we have other mechanisms that are more just focused on specific sectors,
Right.
let's say. Because there's always going to be opportunities where it's like, well, that one's worth a flyer, but we're not really actually going to build a sectoral strategy around it. And you'll need a mechanism by which to make an investment in those long-term innovation capabilities or one-offs within a sector that's not a priority sector. But that shouldn't be the entirety of our industrial strategy, right? And the second major improvement of the Canada Growth Fund is that it's independent. So it's not in the line department; it's over in the CPP, in the pension fund. And so what that gives it is this a little bit of isolation from the to and fro of the Prime Minister's office or the Minister's office in ISED, and therefore it can make its determinations on its own technocratic criteria, rather than whatever politics is saying we should do. So it's actually a major improvement, but yes, we've got further to go in Canada for sure.
The other thing I want to talk to you about is is your work at the Transition Accelerator, because I have debates all the time about why we shouldn't build pipelines, why we shouldn't build more LNG plants, and my basic argument is the proponents of those kinds of oil and gas projects use the OPEC modeling, which shows quite substantial growth between now and 2050, 2075. From their point of view, we're heading into the age of oil. I mean, the golden age of oil. But there are plenty of other, in fact, there are probably three or four times as many modelers who say no, peak demand in 2030 and then a decline sometime between then and 2035. And so now what we're talking about would be building infrastructure like pipelines in a sunset industry, which in my opinion, a very poor use of public dollars and political capital. Far better for us to look at this and say, hey, this is a worst case scenario. We need to consider this. And do we have alternatives to the way we've done things, for 100 years? Because the strategy now is just get more customers for the different customers for the way we've always done things. But we could do things differently. An industrial strategy is the way to do things differently.
Absolutely. I agree completely. We're recording this on Good Friday. Last night was the debate. And, you know, God bless Monsieur Blanchet, who said a pipeline that gets finished in 15 years is not a coherent response to Trump's threats against our
Yeah.
country's sovereignty. So that I thought was coherent and well put. Um, but I think that you're absolutely right. This week, the OPEC Secretariat announced their projection for 2026 for oil demand, and it was a downward revision. And this to me was so funny because in 2022, OPEC put out a forecast that was effectively flat after 2030, like maybe there was a few 100,000 barrels additional per year after 2030, but basically nothing, less than a percentage point increase. And then last year, they made a big deal of ratcheting up their forward demand projection. And then now they're basically putting it back down to where it was in 2022. And really, again, we opened with China. We're coming back around to China. China is taking a big chunk out of oil demand in East Asia. The electrification of the transport sector is going extremely quickly. And they further have announced industrial strategy plays in sustainable aviation fuel and in shipping fuel. And part of this is because once they no longer need the gasoline coming out of the refineries, they no longer need the other parts of the stack coming out of the hydrocracker. And that means that they just need to shed a certain percentage of demand across the whole spectrum of fossil fuel use. And yeah, they're taking a very clear line here, right? They're prioritizing energy security, independence from international oil flows, and they're going to reduce dependence because it helps their industrial strategy and their economy, but also because they don't want to be spending foreign currency, hard-earned foreign currency on oil and gas. And guess what? Pakistan is making the same bet. Pakistan was supposed to be driving LNG demand for a long time. They installed more solar panels than any other country besides the United States and China last year. This is just a revolution that is happening in the middle income countries, especially in the world. And it's going to come for Canadian oil demand sooner rather than later. And we have to be ready.
Here's a point. I have read the OPEC modeling, both the last year's and the year before. And their primary assumption is that while oil demand will decline in the global north, which includes North America and Europe,
Yes.
probably China, I think we could put them in there.
Yes.
So it will decline there between now and 2050. But the growth in the global south will not only will it offset, it will more than offset, which is how they account for the growth. And what do we see in the last 2 years is China going hell bent for leather, exporting and setting up factories in the global south, in places like Brazil and Turkey and Pakistan and all over the place. And so the primary assumption of OPEC's modeling has just had the pins kicked out of it. And in Canada, now you're plugged into this kind of conversation, this kind of research. I don't find many people who are. And I find our conversation about energy here is akin to late 20th century. We're like
Yeah,
20 years behind.
I couldn't agree more. I think when I look at our export table, even before Trump, and I see that the top line item is oil and gas, I think that's a long-term liability that we need to rectify immediately. And when Trump applied his tariffs, then we started to take an even harder look at that export table. And we realized that even though we've got a lot of auto exports, we've got a lot of auto imports. Actually, we run a deficit in auto imports, not with the United States, but mostly with our Asian partners. We're about even with the United States and that's why a Canadian industry makes sense because in North America we produce about as many cars as we consume for the North American market. Um, but when Trump called the question, he basically exposed that our trade dependency on the United States was quite simply a dependency on our oil exports, right? So he took this question, which was going to be called in the Canadian context at some point in the next 10 years,
Right.
right? And you and I maybe think it's 2028, that question is going to get called. The hawks on the BMO commodities desk might think it's 2036 that it'll get called, but it's going to get called, right? Um, and he called the question today. And how we decide to answer that question in the current moment is deciding whether or not we are going to be a prosperous nation in the future or not.
Agree wholeheartedly. You've probably been watching energy media videos.
That's what every night I put my kids to bed and then I put on my suspenders and I go to wash the dishes and I put on energy media.
Oh, I thank you very much for lying, Bentley. I really appreciate it. Little fibs like
You're
that
right. I don't wear
make my whole
suspenders.
day. But
That would
look,
just
here's the problem. It is and we put our finger on it here. Is that we need a more robust conversation in this country about where energy is going and where the energy transition, frankly, where the whole technology revolution is going. Because I had an interview with Dmitry Anastasakis from University of Toronto. And what's really clear is that we're in a technology revolution, and energy has now become a subset of that revolution. It's not a commodity, it's a different thing. And this is true. We're talking about materials, we're talking about chemistries, we're talking about artificial intelligence. And we are not having, here in Canada, the right conversation about how to position Canada in those global supply chains so
yes.
that we can prosper, our kids can prosper, our grandkids can prosper.
Yeah, I think that's really instructive, and the recent Public Policy Forum study of trade diversification strategies, I think, was instructive on this point. They had a very good group of people, and it's a really excellent report, and it's very well done, and it's hard to impugn the solutions that they came up with, such as selling large amounts of agricultural goods to China as a trade diversification strategy away from the United States. And of course, that's something that we should look at. But it's a very narrow view to think that we should focus on sending mostly raw or lightly processed agricultural goods to China as a pathway to future prosperity. We need to build dynamic innovation and manufacturing systems, both for the clean energy future, but also now for national defense. We need to rebuild that industry. And actually, if you look at our manufacturing exports to Europe, you see that we actually export a lot of aircraft and aircraft parts into the European value chain. And that's an opportunity where we can grow. We're also starting to export things like electric vehicles and value-added wood products, mostly LSL and forms of structural lumber, but also mass timber is starting to pick up as well. Um, so these other things where we're really adding a lot of value and building a manufacturing engine, those need to be the focus of our energies, and not creating a dependency on China, which yeah, is a long-term security threat. And just because it's comparably looks better than the United States did 3 months ago doesn't mean it's a safe bet.
Bentley, is it not true that as economies develop from, through the various stages up to what would we call it, a modern economy, a prosperous economy, a rich economy, whatever, they go up the value chain. They might start with raw materials, But then they use their comparative advantages, their competitive advantages, and they work their way up the value chain. And Canada, we've done some good stuff in getting up that value chain, but there's far too much of our natural resources that are still at the bottom of the value chain. And if we want to prosper long term, we need to get those industries up that value chain. Is that a fair argument?
I think it is, but I think telling it in a historical way that only goes one direction doesn't quite capture the complexity and the uncertainty of the current moment. It's true that we have seen that countries develop in the way that you say. But now with the advent of robotics really taking the labor component out of manufacturing, there is a huge opportunity to reshore manufacturing to countries like Canada, which are clean energy superpowers, right? Which have a lot of cheap calories available, because that's going to be the backbone of the chemicals industry, the manufacturing industry globally in the future, right? We're going to go from onshoring to power shoring. We're going to manufacture things in places where we can get the best clean power. And Canada has to focus on that, right? We have to realize that our clean energy is a critical component of our strength in the global economy today. And that's going to allow us to, yeah, mess with the way that manufacturing development and economic development has unfolded in the global economy. And I think we just really need to, rather than think that we have a very clear roadmap of where things are going to go, build systems and structures that can be agile and nimble in response to the reconfiguration of global order. Because at this point, we're dismantling the institutions that were created post Second World War, and we're just not sure exactly what is going to follow them. So we can do good by building up our manufacturing base in this flexible way that allows us to contribute to a bunch of different sectors, and build it on a strong base of clean power, critical minerals, lumber, investing in our people through human capital formation, but also building up our research and development base. We've got to do all these kind of structural things that will mean that the ebb and flow of the global economy won't go by us, but that we'll be able to seize the opportunities that arise when they arise.
Bentley, this has been a fascinating conversation, as all my conversations with you are. But this is a good place for us to wrap up the interview. And I'm going to be coming back to you in the not too distant future because the themes that we've talked about here, once we have a new government in place, at this point it looks like Mark Carney and the Liberals, but hey, it's still 10 days left in the campaign. Anything could happen. So the question of how Canada will respond to this new global economic order, to the pressure from the United States thanks to Trump, we're going to need to talk about this a lot more. So consider this the first of a number of conversations. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Markham. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.